A rich man in a room full of doctors made fun of me for being a factory worker. 20 minutes later, a famous watchmaker stood up. He pointed at my wrist. He asked how I'd ended up wearing one of only 12 watches he'd ever made. I didn't even want to be at that party. My wife Eleanor had just retired. 38 years at the hospital. The last 12, she ran the whole place. Her co-workers threw her a gala, real chandeliers, string quartet in the corner, waiters carrying trays of wine I wasn't going to drink. I stood off to the side in my one good jacket, navy, a little tight in the shoulders now, and did the thing I always do at these things. I counted the exits, not because I wanted to leave, because a factory floor teaches you to always know where the door is. Every few minutes, someone would ask what I did. I'd say, I work at a plant. Machines, mostly. And I'd watch their eyes do. The thing eyes do. A flicker, a polite nod, a search for someone more interesting to talk to. Eleanor caught my eye from across the room. She was laughing at something a colleague said. Champagne glass loose in her hand, completely in her element. 31 years married to that woman, and I still didn't know how she did it, how she made a room feel like it belonged to her. I didn't need the room to belong to me. I just needed her to come find me again before I ran out of things to look. Had I checked my watch? Old habit, scratched glass, band replaced twice. The kind of watch you forget you're wearing until somebody else notices it. Eleanor gave it to me 31 years ago, back when we could barely pay rent, let alone buy anything that looked this expensive. There were words carved into the back. I never understood them. I never asked why. I was about to find out why that was a mistake. Richard Vale had been circling me all night. I noticed it before the toast even started. Early on, he'd walked past with a drink in his hand and said, loud enough for 2 other people to hear, "David, right? Eleanor's told us so much about you. Very, hands-on, I hear." Everyone laughed a little. I smiled and said nothing, because there was nothing worth saying to a man who'd already decided what I was. 20 minutes later, refilling his glass near me, he tried again. "Must be nice," he said, nodding toward the room, getting to enjoy. All this without having to give the speech. I let that one go too. I'd been letting things go for 31 years. It never cost me anything to let a man like Richard feel clever. Then he stood up to give the real toast. He said nice things about Eleanor, called her amazing, said the hospital wouldn't be the same without her. Then he smiled and looked right at me. People call someone self-made when they forget how much the right foundation helped them. A few people laughed, quietly. Not because it was funny, because they knew exactly who he meant. I looked down at my jacket, the same one I always wore, to these things, and said nothing. Then the chandelier light hit my watch, and everything changed. Across the table, an old man stopped mid-bite. He was staring at my wrist like he'd seen a ghost. "May I see that?" I looked behind me, thinking. He meant someone else. He pointed straight at my watch. I took it off, handed it over. His hands were shaking before he even turned it over. He held it up toward the light first, tilting it, the way you'd check a coin for a mint mark. Then he turned it over slowly in his palm, running his thumb along the edge like he was reading, it in Braille. His name was Arthur Bell. I'd never heard of him. Half the table clearly had. I watched 2 women lean toward each other and start whispering behind their napkins. He was one of the best watchmakers in the country. Museums wanted his work. Collectors waited years for one piece. He read the words on the back. His mouth moved slightly, like he was saying them to himself. Then he looked up. Not at me. At Eleanor. "You never told him?" Eleanor's voice went very quiet. "No." Somewhere down the table, a man muttered, "Told him what?" to his wife, and she shushed him. Nobody was eating anymore. "Told me what?" "Do you know how many of these watches exist?" Arthur asked. I shrugged. To me, it was just a good watch that survived 31 years of factory work and one bad fall off a ladder. 12, Arthur said. The table went silent. The waiters stopped. moving. Richard couldn't help himself. And how much would something like that be worth? Arthur looked at him the way you'd look at someone asking the wrong question at a funeral. If I told you, he said, you'd stop listening to the story and just start looking at David differently. Hear the story first. Richard shut up. I had a feeling I wasn't going to like what came next. 31 years ago, Arthur made 12 watches. Not to sell, each one built for a person who had changed his life in a way he could never repay. Not rich people, not famous ones, a nurse, a teacher, a bus driver, a widow, and one hospital worker. He looked at Eleanor. Your wife ordered watch number 12. I turned to look at her. She was staring at her hands. But, Arthur said, she didn't order it for herself. She ordered it for me. I sat back in my chair. I felt like I was floating outside my own body. She walked into my shop 31 years ago, Arthur said, right after her first big promotion. I figured she wanted something nice for herself. She said, I need something for my husband. I asked what he did. She said he fixed machines. At a factory. I laughed a little, thought she meant an engineer. She said, no, he fixes things with his hands. Then she told him what I'd done for her. Not everything. Just enough. This wasn't a woman buying a gift, Arthur said. This was a woman trying to say something she didn't have words for. I looked at Eleanor. She still hadn't looked up. What didn't you tell me? I asked. I wasn't even sure what I was asking about yet. I remembered that year. I'd spent 30 years trying to forget it. We were renting a 2-room apartment above a laundromat back then, the kind of place where you could hear the dryers thumping through the floor at midnight. Eleanor was 2 years into a nursing degree she'd taken out loans to afford, working a part-time front desk shift at the hospital just to get her foot in the door. Then her father died. No warning. His heart on a Tuesday. Her mother fell apart, in a way that scared both of us. Doctor visits, medication schedules neither of them could keep straight. Somebody needed to sit with her on the bad days, and the bad days outnumbered the good ones by a wide margin. I remember Eleanor at our kitchen table one night, tuition bills and her mother's pharmacy receipts spread out in front of her like a losing hand of cards. She didn't cry. She just stared at the numbers like they might rearrange themselves if she looked long enough. I think I have to quit, she said. I can't do the degree in this. Something has to go. I'd just been made night, shift foreman at the plant. Small raise, nothing dramatic. I didn't tell her what I did with it. I picked up every overtime shift the floor manager would give me. Doubles on weekends, the graveyard slot nobody wanted on holidays. I started paying down her tuition balance a little at a time in amounts, small enough that the number never seemed to move all at once. I drove her mother to appointments before my shift started and after it ended, still in my work boots. I taught myself to make 4 meals, badly at first, because takeout wasn't in the budget anymore. She'd come home some nights and find me asleep sitting up at the table, still in my uniform. She never asked why I looked that tired. I think some part of her already knew, and knew better than to make me say it out loud. And when she told me she was done, really done, ready to give up on the degree entirely, I didn't argue with her. I just said, then give up tomorrow. Tonight you're still going. She went. She kept going for years after that. I never once brought up what it cost me, because it never felt like a cost. It felt like the only thing to do. I never knew that one sentence had stuck with her for 31 years. I was about to find out exactly how much. I want to tell you why I remember Eleanor walking into my shop like it was yesterday, Arthur said. His voice dropped. My daughter was 6. Scarlet fever that turned into something much worse. A heart complication nobody caught in time. Bad diagnosis. Worse odds. My wife and I had no idea how any of it worked. Specialists, insurance forms, a system that seemed built to exhaust you before the illness could. We were drowning, and a junior hospital worker, barely more than a kid herself, decided to fix it for us. During the day, on shifts that weren't even hers, she tracked down the right specialist. She found paperwork that had been lost in some office for 2 weeks. She called doctors after hours on her own time when she didn't have to. And on the night we thought we might lose her, the night the machines were beeping in a rhythm I still hear sometimes, she sat with my wife in that hallway until 4 in the morning. So my wife wouldn't be alone. He looked at Eleanor. She never once told me she'd done anything special. To her, it was just her job. But I never forgot it. So when she walked into my shop years later, I recognized her instantly. I told her I wouldn't charge full price. She said no. Why? I asked. Eleanor answered instead. Because you taught me that if someone gives you their time, you don't measure it in money. I want you to understand what my workshop looked like back then, Arthur said. Small. 1 bench, bad lighting, a kettle that never worked right. I made watches nobody had heard of, for people nobody would call important. Eleanor sat across that bench from me for almost 2 hours. I asked her to tell me about you. Not what you did, but who you were. She told me about the overtime, the meals you didn't know how to cook, the way you never once made her feel like she owed you an explanation for the bills getting smaller. By the time she left, I wasn't building her a watch anymore. I was building yours. He set it down gently, on the tablecloth, like it might break. That's when I decided to make something extra special, more than the other 11. He picked the watch back up and turned it over, pointing at the words I'd looked at 1,000 times without understanding. 4. The man who gave her the time to become who she was. I used to think it was something off a card, I said quietly. It's not off a card. Then he did something I didn't expect. He popped the back off the watch with a tiny tool from his pocket, like he'd done it 1,000 times. Inside, hidden where you'd never think to look, 2 letters, DM, and a date. I stared at it for a long moment before it landed. It was the date I got promoted at the factory. The night I started taking extra shifts, the same night I realized now that I'd come home and quietly decided not to tell Eleanor where the money would come from. Eleanor had given him that exact date, a photo, a letter. She wanted the watch, to carry the whole story, even if she never said it out loud. Then Eleanor grabbed Arthur's sleeve. Arthur, please. He shook his head. He deserves to know. There was more. She didn't just buy this watch with spare money, Arthur said. She spent almost her entire first real paycheck. I remembered it now. Coming home that week, finding her sitting quietly at the kitchen table, hands folded like she was bracing for bad news. Did they short your paycheck? I'd asked. No, I just bought something. I never asked again. Something in her face told me not to push it. I forgot about it completely, until 31 years later, in a room full of strangers. She wanted the first thing she ever bought with her own money, Arthur said, to belong to the man who helped her earn it. I couldn't say anything. Eleanor was crying openly now, and Richard was about to make it worse. Well, Richard said, straightening his jacket. Eleanor clearly had the support of the right people. That's all I meant. Eleanor turned to him. Her voice was steadier than I'd ever heard it. No, Richard, I had the support of the right person. Nobody laughed this time. I don't care what the watch is worth, I said to Arthur, because I couldn't trust myself to look at Richard. Arthur smiled. I know. That's exactly why Eleanor chose you. He never gave a number. Not once, all night. Someone down the table whispered a guess to their spouse. Arthur let it hang there, unanswered. That silence landed harder than any number could have. But Arthur still wasn't finished. There's one more thing, he said. Something I only figured out myself years later. Back then, my factory had a deal with the hospital. When their big machines broke, like sterilizers, boilers, they called us. I got sent on plenty of overnight calls nobody else wanted. The kind where you drive across town at 2 in the morning half asleep with a toolbox on the passenger seat. During my daughter's stay, Arthur said, The exact same week Eleanor sat. In that hallway until 4 in the morning, a machine needed for her treatment started failing. An alarm nobody could silence. A maintenance worker on the night shift caught it, fixed it, had it running again before the morning staff even showed up. He wrote it down as routine. He never knew whose daughter's life depended on that machine. Arthur only found the repair record years later, going through old hospital files out of curiosity about the man his gift had gone to. My name was on it, I said. I sat there trying to remember that night specifically and couldn't. It was one repair out of thousands. One more shift walking hospital hallways half asleep, thinking about nothing but getting home before sunrise. Eleanor was the reason I made the 12th watch, Arthur said. That part I always understood. But when I found your name in that record, realized what you'd done the same week without either of you knowing about the other, that's when I understood why the watch belonged to you. Not just because your wife asked. Because it had. Always, somehow, already been true. The room felt different after that. People who'd barely glanced at me all night were looking at me differently now. I took the watch off, held it out to Arthur. You should keep it, it's your work. He pushed it back. No, it's yours. Why? Because I didn't make 12 watches for 12 rich people, he said. I made them for 12 people who gave something valuable without ever expecting anyone to notice. Nobody at the table said a whoa. Then Eleanor stood up. She took my hand in both of hers, looked around at everyone who'd spent the whole night congratulating her. Tonight everyone told me what a great career I built, she said. But nobody in this room saw the years I was just a scared young woman who didn't know if she could keep going. She looked down at me. He never asked for credit. Never asked to be introduced as anything more than my husband. Never once complained that my career grew bigger than his. She squeezed my hand. If you want to know what made me successful, don't look at my office. Look at the man who waited for me to come home every night. I don't remember much after that. Richard found somewhere else to be. Arthur shook my hand for a long time before he left. Take care of the watch, he told me. Not because of what it's worth, because of everything it's already survived. Later, in our own kitchen, I set the watch on the table between us. Eleanor made tea neither of us wanted, just so our hands had something to do. So why didn't you ever tell me? I asked. Because then you would have worn it differently. She touched the scratched glass, the worn edges, 31 years of a life lived without any fuss. You would have been scared to scratch it. We sat with that for a while, the kettle ticking as it cooled on the stove. 31 years, I said, mostly to myself. I don't think I ever once thanked you for staying. You did, she said. Every night you came home instead of somewhere easier. I asked her if she remembered that kitchen table, the real one, the one above the laundromat, the bills and the receipts spread out like a losing hand. Every detail, she said. I remember thinking I had nothing left to give anyone, and you just kept showing up anyway, not because you had to, because you decided to, over and over, on nights I never even knew about until tonight. I laughed finally, for the first time all evening. I put the watch back on. I've worn it every day since. I haven't thought once about what it's worth. 31. Years later, I finally understood what that watch had been keeping time for. Us. If this story hit you, hit subscribe. There's a new one every week about the quiet people who turn out to be the strongest ones in the room. And tell me in the comments, what's the one thing someone did for you that you never got the chance to repay?